Okay, I believe we are recording, so word to the wise. Welcome to Women's Work Beyond the Home. I'm going to let Maggie Kase say more about that in just a couple minutes. Maggie Kase, I would love to introduce to you. She is the interim executive director of the Southwest Seattle Historical Society, located at the Log House Museum, which has been closed temporarily, but will be open to the public starting April 8th, Friday through Sunday, 12 to 4. She came over from the Gates Foundation Discovery Center, earned her master's at UW in museum studies, moved to Washington about 5 years ago now, from North Adams, Massachusetts, which is very close to where my sister is, where she trained at Mass MoCA and the Clarks. So let's give her a warm welcome. Thank you for being here, Maggie Kase.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. First question for all of you. Would you like me to use the microphone? Can you hear me okay? What is your preference?
I can hear. Fine. It's okay, yeah.
Okay.
What do you say, John?
Fabulous.
Can you take your mask off?
I don't know, Alan. Can I take my mask off? I'd be happy to.
Since you are more than 10 feet away from the next person, yes, you can take your mask off. And try to be loud for the camera, too. And I'm going to try and move away, because I'm probably louder than you are.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. As Alan said, I am Maggie Kase, and I am the interim executive director of the Southwest Seattle Historical Society. And I'm thrilled to be here today to present Women's Work Beyond the Home, which explores women's history in Seattle in the 1940s and a little bit in the 1950s. But before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the Southwest Seattle Historical Society and our Log House Museum are located on the traditional lands of the Duwamish people, past and present. And I'd just like to really take a second to honor with gratitude both the land itself and the Duwamish people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. Women's Work Beyond the Home is made possible by the support of our sponsors, Luna Park Cafe, For Culture, Alki Beach Academy, and Home Street Bank. Before we completely dive in, I do have to tell you a little bit about us. So the Southwest Seattle Historical Society's mission is to promote local history through education, preservation, and advocacy. The Historical Society hosts a really wide range of programs and educational opportunities like the one you're about to see today that explore the history of the Duwamish Peninsula, and we can't offer programs like the one you're about to enjoy without your support, so thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And as Alan mentioned, we also do run a physical location called the Log House Museum. The museum is going to reopen Friday, April 8th. Feel free to come see us Friday through Sunday from 12 p.m. to 4 p.m. to get the in-person experience of the Historical Society. Our current exhibit is The Spirit Returns 2.0, a Duwamish and Settler story, which is a dual-hosted exhibit between ourselves and the Duwamish Longhouse and Cultural Center, which is also down in West Seattle, which is really exciting. Some of you might have seen a presentation I did about that a couple months ago, and April is a really great time to come down and experience the exhibit in person. So with all of that aside, let's dive straight in. So this presentation is kind of a fun one for me. Typically when I talk on topics that are related to our work, it's about what we're doing at the museum right now or in an upcoming public program that we want to do a little bit of a deeper dive on. But this one, Women's Work Beyond the Home, is actually inspired by a previous exhibit that we did called War on the Home Front, as well as an upcoming exhibit that's going to be debuting this year that explores race, class, and gender in the 1950s. So it was exciting for me to be able to do a little bit of something different here in this presentation today. And I've been thinking a lot lately about how we're often taught history in sort of broad strokes. We track big historical changes that happen in kind of sweeping movements and moments that create large amounts of change. And often those movements are important because they're really shifting what our social norms are in some way. But when we think about history in this way, we can sometimes miss some of the nuance about what really happened leading up to those big moments. It can feel like they came out of nowhere when in actuality there was decades and decades of work being done before these large changes happened. And I really think that that's the beauty of local history and exploring some of the work that we do at the Historical Society, is we really get to dig into individual stories and life experiences that really show and illustrate what it was like to live through major social changes. So that's a lot of what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be exploring some oral history excerpts from that exhibit I mentioned, War on the Home Front, which will be really exciting. And I think that oftentimes when we think about great advances for women throughout history very specifically, we're thinking of those really big moments, right? Things like the granting of women's suffrage in the early 20th century, or second wave feminism in the 1970s, which leads to large historic legislative change, things of that nature. And those moments are really important, but when we focus on them pretty exclusively, we lose the stories of those change makers that led up to, again, those huge, large changes. We lose the women who pushed back against societal norms in their day-to-day lives, who inspired others to do the same, who set the tone for what life could be like in the future. And then, of course, we also lose the women who are not always a part of the dominant narrative, often including trans women or women of color and working class women, just to name a few examples. The 1940s was, of course, a really interesting time for women's history and a very dynamic time for history across the entire globe. When I think of the 40s in relationship to women's history and women's rights, often the first image that comes to mind, and I'm sure is true for many of you, is Rosie the Riveter. Rosie, of course, was a wartime symbol who was really designed specifically to encourage women to help on the home front as well as abroad. Over the course of World War II, Rosie was imagined and then reimagined many, many, many times. In some pieces, she encouraged gardening and self-reliance and victory gardens. In others, she is the symbol of the working woman, and in others still, she is used to promote the Women's Army Corps and the Women's Air Force Service pilots. Often, I think that this paints a picture that many of us think of when we're thinking of the 1940s. Suddenly, many, although of course not all, women were given the societal freedom and permission to work outside the home, and women often flocked to these positions. In 1945, women made up 37% of the workforce, a historic high, and nearly 1 in 4 married women specifically held a job outside the home, which was pretty much unheard of prior to that. And it's that last statistic that many people really latch onto when they're thinking about women's history. The ability to get married and do something other than run the household and manage the family, although of course many women still wanted to be focusing on that as well. It was the option and the freedom of that option that felt so important and so revolutionary to many at that time. And it's also important to note as well that these open positions, these new positions, were of course largely for defense production. In 1943, women made up 65% of the United States aircraft workforce. In pre-war times, less than 1% of that aircraft industry was staffed by women. So a very, very, very huge jump there very quickly. And of course, this was especially true in Seattle, and especially the West Seattle White Center and South Park area where my museum is located, because of Boeing, of course, as well as the shipyards. In the 40s, in our area, Boeing was really crucial to the increase of opportunities for women and people all over the country to be able to work. As part of our exhibit, War on the Home Front, we interviewed alumni from West Seattle High School's classes of 1944 and 1945, which was a really, really interesting initiative we were able to take on. These alumni spent pretty much their entire high school experiences while World War II was happening. So our oral histories to support this project give life to some of the statistics that I've just talked about and cited to all of you. So I think actually we're going to start by looking at a few examples of what local alumni remember of these new opportunities for women, which started kind of at the school level and worked its way up. So we're just going to spend a few minutes. I'll read some oral history interview quotes to you, and we'll talk to them. But I want to say first that this kind of oral history project is a really, really, really small slice of the experience. Of course, it's limited to West Seattle High School alumni, so we're starting really small there. And of the 8 oral histories we were able to conduct, 7 of them were with white women, with white people. Half of them were women, half of them were with men, and 1 Japanese American woman. So a lot of these oral histories are really, really skewed towards one very specific experience. And I just wanted to kind of give that heads up here. I'm not trying to say that this describes all experiences, but I thought that this gave a really interesting pushback to this idea that in the 40s, everybody sort of flocked to work. It was this brand new thing that kind of just suddenly exploded. So with all of those caveats, all of that context, let's dive in. So our first quote on the screen here is all about schools and opportunities. One thing that did change very, very suddenly for young girls at this time was suddenly in school, there were a lot more classes that you were allowed to take in the early 1940s. So Jane H. here says, you didn't cross the threshold of the auto shop and woodworking shop, and those kinds of things like the boys didn't cross the threshold of the home economics classes either. But this opened, totally wiped out that barrier. As a matter of fact, girls even took a class on working on cars at that time. And later in this oral history interview, Jane goes on to say how those experiences really made her feel empowered to do different kinds of work for the first time, and how exciting it was for her to be able to kind of branch out in her interests in her studies while she was still in high school. And she remembers it being a very sudden change. You know, in middle school, when she was preparing to go into high school, these classes weren't offered as an option. All of a sudden, 1942, she's got the whole world as her oyster sort of situation, which was really interesting. But of course, it wasn't just about kind of new classroom opportunities. It was also about the ways in which school and work sort of interlapped and overlapped at the time. So here we have Joanne saying, I started work when I was in the 9th grade at Woolworth's 10-cent store. There was one in the junction, the West Seattle Junction. They had a Crest and a Woolworth's. They couldn't get people, so they were taking 14 and 15-year-olds, and my grandmother worked there at the same time I did. That wasn't too good. So another interesting change here, of course, was the fact that many generations of people were often going back to work here. Grandmothers, as Joanne was saying, which she was not quite so fond of, that her grandmother felt like she had to go back to work. But also younger people than ever before were going to work here, and Joanne was expected to navigate working as a freshman in high school part-time while also navigating her studies, which was really interesting. And thinking more about that life balance, so just for some context here, Rachel is the interviewer, Joanne is the person who's being interviewed, and Betty is another oral history interviewee who just happened to be there for the conversation. So we start with Rachel saying, while you were you working in the city? Joanne says at Sears, and this Sears specifically is the one that was on First Ave at the time, so she was working downtown. Rachel asks, what was it like trying to balance school and work? And Joanne says, I just did it. Betty chimes in saying, everybody did, everybody had a job. Joanne ends this area saying, yeah, that was our culture. You worked, you went to school, you rode the bus everywhere you went. That last little bit was because Joanne had been talking to Rachel about some of the differences, of course, between growing up in the mid-20th century and growing up now, talking about the fact that you kind of just had your list of responsibilities that you did in the day. You went from place to place. There was no way to get in contact with your family, and everyone just kind of assumed that you were where you said you were. So she was sort of comparing and contrasting that experience. But again, for Joanne, it was very much, there wasn't really a question of life balance or work and school. It was just what you did and what you were expected to do, and because of that, she did it, which was interesting. To me, at least. So thinking about all of these quotes that we just read, what do we learn from them? So these were some of the big things that I pulled out. So to me, these quotes really encapsulate what I was expecting to find from these oral histories about World War II. Of course, we talk about the fact that there were new working and school opportunities. Women of all ages were taking these opportunities, many while they were still in school. Many of the women we interviewed discussed then going on to the University of Washington, and then pretty shortly afterwards getting married and moving out of the workforce in the later half of the decade leading into the 1950s. And this, to me, really all fits into that larger narrative of social change that we often see today when we think very broadly about life in the 1940s. The women that we interviewed, of course, were also additionally a mix of working class and middle class women. These oral histories were really shaped by the housing shortage in Seattle. As people flocked to this area, housing got bought up very, very quickly. One of our oral history participants described the fact that at the time her family was lucky enough to own their house in West Seattle. It was a 2-bedroom house, and at the height of the war, there were 12 families living in her house because that's how many people were looking for work, and that was one way their family felt like they could sort of give back to the cause and what was happening. So that's a lot of people in a 2-bedroom house. So of course, that kind of experience really shapes the way that you see all of these new opportunities. And again, their experiences because of this are also then really shaped by whether their families are renting or own their own houses, how their families were affected by the Great Depression. One of the women we interviewed, her family was almost decimated by the Great Depression. So coming out into the 40s, when all of a sudden there are all these new jobs and all of these new opportunities for her and her family, felt like a blessing almost, as terrible as the war was, to be able to say, now we can survive. We have this opportunity to make money and we all need to take it. I will say though, for some of the others, this idea of married working women and working women at all was very much not new. It ran in their families. And many of the women that we interviewed already had jobs when the war began. They had new opportunities, of course, but a lot of them were educational, and a lot of these women were very much already ingrained in the workforce in Seattle, which I thought was really interesting. So now we're going to look at a couple oral history quotes that don't quite fit, I guess, what I was expecting to find, so to say. So they talk a little bit about different new experiences. And I think that one of the most interesting things I saw in these upcoming quotes is the fact that many women talk about what their mothers were doing, saying, well, this is what my mother did, and therefore this is what I did, and my mother especially was kind of going against the social norm at the time, but to me it just felt normal. This is how I was raised. So starting off strong here with work and motherhood, GY is our oral history interviewer who asked not to be named, so a little code name there for her. And Betty is, again, one of our oral history participants. So we start with the question, and did you end up being a stay-at-home mom with your kids and then just working at Frederick and Nelson's intermittently? Frederick and Nelson was one of the big department stores. Yeah, you all know.
Yeah.
Betty says, yeah, just part-time. My mother had always worked. I mean, she was a woman before her time like your mom. She always worked back in the 20s, and I just didn't want to be that mom. I wanted to be home with my kids, so that affected me, I think. GY then asks, what did she do? And Betty says, she was a stenographer secretary. She graduated from high school and went right in and got a job as a private secretary to the superintendent of schools of Seattle right out of high school. I mean, she could type like nobody's business, take shorthand. I didn't want to be that person. So as we were talking about before, for some people, they saw these new working opportunities and were like, yeah, that's who I am. I want to be that person. Betty worked in, I believe, credit as well as the personnel department on and off at Frederick and Nelson's through most of her life. But she felt really attached to the idea of living that sort of very traditional family values lifestyle. She wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. She wanted to raise her kids. And she wasn't all that excited about the new work opportunities. In fact, I think that the one piece that got cut off here is Betty a little sarcastically saying, sorry, at the very end of that sentence. Oh. So she felt really passionately about the fact that this is what she wanted to do. And while she was really proud of her mother for being a woman in the 20s and really moving forward, you know, being married and still working and raising kids, that wasn't the life that she wanted personally. But again, you know, we've got this idea of a working legacy here. So here we've got Rachel, our same oral history interviewer, and Pat, and they're talking about Pat's mother now. And Rachel says, yeah, your connection to that was through your mother, and did she go to work due to the war, or had she been working previous to the war beginning? And Pat says, I'm not sure about that. She was a very much in-demand substitute teacher. She had been a high school principal. Imagine being a woman high school principal in 1917. And Rachel replies, wow, what high school? And Pat says, back in Minnesota. And then my dad was one of their teachers, and they had gone to the University of Iowa together. They decided to go off and get married, and then she couldn't officially teach anymore. Did you know that way back then they couldn't? They couldn't teach full-time or do anything full-time if they were married. Have you ever ran into that before? And this is one of the, I would say, biggest running themes that I saw throughout our oral histories, thinking specifically about women's history and women's work, was not only this idea that women were paying homage to their mothers, often saying, my mom felt like a trendsetter, my mom was moving forward, but also looking at the limitations their mother had, especially in regards to teaching. Multiple women asked Rachel actually through this whole process, did you know that they would have to stop working after they got married? That seems mind-boggling now that somebody would have to stop working after they got married. So that was a big, big, big running theme, is this idea of legacy in regards to women's work. And then lastly, this one is fun. This is with Joanne again. Another teacher. Rachel says, you mentioned your mother was a teacher. Was she a teacher while you were in high school also? And Joanne says, no. She had started out at Sears after high school, and that was World War I. When the men were returning, they took away her job. So they were going to put her down to a lower job, so she said, not me, and went to Bellingham and became a teacher. At one time I said to her, you know, Mom, you were the beginning of the women's liberation movement. And she said, oh, Joanne, I never burned my bra. I said, that isn't the answer to the women's liberation movement. And to me, so much of this encapsulated, I guess, the point I was thinking about when I was creating this presentation as I'm thinking of this exhibit, is that first of all, change starts decades and decades and decades before. It's a woman who's a high school principal in 1917, raising a woman who then goes to work and things of that nature. But it's also, I think, the ways in which we push back against our own social norms in our everyday lives that don't necessarily feel revolutionary while we're doing it, right? It doesn't feel like we're burning our bras for the women's liberation movement. But instead, by just kind of stretching out against the boundaries that are placed upon us, we're able to continue moving forward, and we raise people who move forward even farther than that. So I really wanted to use this presentation to just kind of honor all of those change makers who we often don't necessarily think about when we talk about the fact that in the 1940s there was a huge labor boom because of the war and lots of women got to go to work, right? All of this starts by women in the 1910s, the 1920s, and 1930s going to work first and showing others that, yeah, we can do this. That's my Rosie the Riveter moment for today. Not gonna happen again. So again, thinking about how this changes our perspective, social changes are built up over those decades and decades of small action. But also I wanted to talk about the fact that statistical frameworks can vastly change our perspectives on social changes. I was a little tricky at the beginning of this presentation, and I told you that in 1945, 37% of the American workforce was comprised of women. And that statistic is true, but what I didn't tell you, how I potentially skewed your perception of events, is that in 1940, 27% of the workforce was already comprised of women. A 10% jump in 5 years is still a huge increase, don't get me wrong. But the idea that we sort of went from 0 to 100, so to speak, in the 1940s due to wartime efforts, it's just untrue. And I think that on some level we all know this, right? We don't actually think that 1940 happened or 1942 happened, the United States enters the war, and all of a sudden kind of chaos breaks out and there's women in defensive positions, and all of a sudden people are being put into internment camps. It's all of these little things that kind of boil together to create change, both good and really, really bad. But I just kind of wanted to give that little bit of perspective here, because I think that sometimes when we're talking in those broad strokes, we lose that nuance, that a 10% jump and a 37% jump are very, very, very different things. And then, of course, I also, again, just want to acknowledge that these oral histories are only pushing back up against a very, very specific part of this history, right? The women that we interviewed for this project were predominantly of kind of one social background, and therefore are only pushing up against one kind of social experience. And that, I think, becomes extra important as we shift to think a little bit about the 1950s. as a social response to women's work kind of moving outside of the home in the 1940s in a way that felt very drastic societally. There was a smidge of panic, I would say, that kind of rippled through, especially, I would say, kind of the white middle class aspect of the country. And people really worried that we were somehow losing our family-oriented values because of this. So the middle class was booming at a level that was previously unheard of. There was sort of a social movement to regain an American identity that many were worried was falling into disarray. And because of this, there was a series of social guidance films created, which were relatively common at the time, that were essentially created to help guide social behaviors. So I've been talking for a little while now. We're going to take a movie break here and watch one of these social guidance films called A Date with Your Family, directed by Edward C. Simmel. So hold on to your hats, everybody. All right. The sound on this is a little bit low, so my apologies. But this is an interesting experience. I hope we all have fun.
This boy and girl coming home from school look quite content with life. And why not? They're looking forward to an important date, dinner at home with the family. What's the matter? Doesn't that sound exciting to you? Well, to them it's a special occasion, as it has been ever since they sat down to dinner in high chairs. Why should they feel that way about something you take so completely for granted? Well, let's see if we can find out. First of all, daughter has changed from school clothes to something more festive. Dressing a little makes her feel, and consequently look, more charming. Even the table takes on a special air. Mother, too, changes from her daytime clothes. The women of this family seem to feel that they owe it to the men of the family to look relaxed, rested, and attractive at dinner time. Brother is spending an hour before dinner catching up on his homework. He has plans this evening. Perhaps that explains the telephone call. But he won't spend a lot of time on the phone either. When there are several members of the family to be considered, it is not a good idea for one member to monopolize the phone. And it is never good to allow telephone conversations to interfere with studies. Is it that late? Dad will be here any minute. Better tell Mother she's needed in the kitchen. Brother notices the time and realizes that he must put things in order and clean himself up in time for dinner. Hello there. Junior is always in a hurry, particularly for dinner. But first there's a cleanup job to do on this young man. Brother takes it upon himself to help share Junior's responsibility for keeping their room in good order and keeping Junior in good order too. Punctuality is stressed in this household. By that I mean hair is combed and faces and hands scrubbed before the boys come to the table so they won't delay the meal. Now, mother and daughter put the finishing touches on the dinner. Father, too, looks forward to this date with the family. He has had a hard day at the office, and in his briefcase are some contracts which must be looked over tonight. But in the meantime, he will relax at dinner with those he loves. A simple centerpiece made from some flowers which grow in the backyard is another of daughter's contributions to the dinner. But it takes up a little too much room, so she moves it to the sideboard. These boys greet their dad as though they are genuinely glad to see him, as though they had really missed being away from him during the day and are anxious to talk to him. This is the time for pleasant discussion in a thoroughly relaxed mood. They don't pick this time of the day to spring unpleasant surprises on Dad. If they have disagreeable news, they'll postpone the discussion until another time. And this is no time to dun Father for a raise in your allowance, new clothes, or argue about other financial matters. Ah, dinner time. Yes, Mother. Junior remembered to clean up. Brother seats Junior. Then helps Mother to her chair as he would his best girl. Well, the dinner date has begun, and they're all happy about it. Many families throughout the country observe the custom of saying grace at mealtime. It is always treated with reverence and respect. Napkins on the lap, the family awaits service. They converse pleasantly while Dad serves. I said pleasantly, for that is the keynote at dinner time. It is not only good manners, but good sense. Pleasant, unemotional conversation helps digestion. Father serves Mother first, then daughter, then the boys. Don't worry, fellas, you won't get left. Help cut your meat, Junior? Of course. By example, older children can teach younger ones good table manners. No one starts eating until Father has served himself. Always wait for the hostess, in this case Mother, to begin eating before you start. Let Father and Mother guide the conversational trend if they desire. After all, they made all this possible. Want to talk over their day with each other. Tell Mother how good the food is. Maybe Sis rates a compliment too. It makes them want to continue pleasing you. Well, all this is good general advice, but there are some specific don'ts. Maybe the family will demonstrate for us. Don't monopolize the conversation and go on and on without stopping. Nothing destroys the charm of a meal more quickly. To say that the rest of the group is bored would be a gross understatement. Don't discuss unpleasant topics such as gruesome sights or sounds or unpleasant occurrences. This is a time of pleasure, charm, and relaxation, remember? Don't make unkind comparisons about your standard of living. The dinner table is no place for discontent. It makes Dad and Mother uncomfortable and unhappy.
Oh, my kids.
Don't insult your brother or sister with offensive remarks about friends. Arguments, harsh words mean tension and distress for everyone. Do remember simply this. Treat the other members of your family with the same respect and cordiality you would show your most treasured friend outside the family circle. This does not mean you should be stiff or formal. With your own family, you can relax. Be yourself. Just be sure it's your best self. This is better. Now things are on an even keel again. Now we're ready for dessert. Most families don't have maids, so Mother needs help with the serving from the kitchen. Son says Mother has done enough. Watch him play butler. The removal of dishes from the main course and the serving of dessert set the stage for the conclusion of a thoroughly pleasant meal. Do you begin to see now how a date with your family can be a truly special occasion? Do you know why brother and sister looked forward to the evening? When the dinner hour at home is treated with a certain amount of graciousness and ceremony, it can be memorable. There is no family so poor but that the evening meal can be eaten in an atmosphere of warmth and gentleness. There is no family so busy but that it can come together in the evening for a dinner date which will give its members something to look back upon with happiness all their days.
What year was that made?
1950 exactly. Let's see. Now, we're all contemporary women and Alan here, so I don't need to deep dive into exactly what was going on in that film. My personal favorite part is the part where they suggest that brother and father give mother and sister compliments because it will encourage them to continue pleasing you. So, with that idea of social guidance and social responsibility, what we see is that this film is a continuation of the sentiment of an idea that we're losing family values somehow. And it's clinging to a very specific set of values for a very specific set of people, right? We see a plethora of ideas here. There's very specific gender norms happening. The mother in this film is kind of charged with being pleasant and calm and creating a 3-course meal every night and very much being the center of the household. Managing the household is in some ways applied to be her whole existence, which she gets to somehow take a break from when everybody else comes home. I love my mother. I don't know that that was quite her experience in my family. I think things just got more chaotic the more people came home. Her daughter is being trained in a very similar manner, right? When brother is often praised in the film for doing things like, quote, playing butler and things of that nature, we see the sister doing very, very similar activities, but because it's just expected of her, nobody says anything about it. The father, of course, comes home from work. He's supporting the family. He's meant to be this head of the household to provide an example for his sons and some very, very disapproving faces when things do not go the way that he wants them to, which were very funny. But what we're seeing here is sort of the embodiment of what the US was supposed to be at that time, striving towards being a white, middle-class, nuclear family. But in reality, the changes that were wrought in the 1940s were very, very, very difficult to shake. In 1950, 1 in 3 women was part of the labor force. Women were continuing to work outside the home, and those numbers only increased drastically throughout the decade. One of the biggest changes was whether married women specifically worked. In the pre-war times, a little less than 10%, about 8%, of married women were either working or seeking work. But in 1950, that figure was, I think, almost 47% of married women were part of that kind of 1 in 3 who were actually working. And throughout that decade, that number continued to grow until the 1980s, when that figure absolutely explodes after, again, decades and decades of work. And more than 2/3 of married women were working, and 86% of single women are also working outside of the home. To get there, though, we needed these women in the 50s to push back against videos like Edward Simmel were creating, saying that this is exactly what a woman's role should be in the house. Just as those women needed to be able to make their place in the labor force, who were supported by those in the 1910s and 20s and 30s. In the 50s as well, we see a kind of pushback about whether women need to be at home. One of the reasons that sort of acceleration of the number of women in the workforce slowed down in the 50s was because there was this huge selling point of this idea that a husband's earning income and potential were sort of the most important things. That if your husband made enough money, there was no need for you to be out at work. You had to be at home. This is where you were actually needed. One of the ways that people were able to push back and kind of circumvent that in the 50s was actually with a booming of part-time work. Prior to that, almost all jobs, not totally all of them, but a significant portion, were actually full-time employment. And the increase of part-time work in the 50s were a way in which a lot of women were able to say, well, I can do both. I can go to work, I can be an earner, I can also be at home, I can hold both of these identities simultaneously. And this growth rate in the 50s means that we start to see some societal and legal barriers to married women working beginning to fall to the wayside, at direct odds with these kind of social norms that we sort of think of when being attributed to the 50s. I don't know about all of you, but while that film was sort of an extreme version of it, when I see media that takes place in the 50s that was written today, it's often got a similar vibe to that. This idea of the nuclear family, that the woman stays home and takes care of the children and the men go out and work. I'm going to leave us here for today, though, because I don't want to spoil too much of our upcoming exhibit that's going to be opening in September of this year. So thank you so much for coming to this program, hopefully learning a little bit about women in the workforce in the 40s and 50s. I hope you enjoyed, and I can take some questions now, or we can just talk. That film was kind of crazy.
Well, I noticed the two brothers, there was such an age difference in them, and to have the same room, and the older one was just like, it was like it's just being a parent, as opposed to just being a brother.
Yeah, that idea of sibling dynamics being really, really different I thought was interesting. The website where that video lives, Internet Archive, has a comments section, which I would offer to show you, but we couldn't put it on YouTube afterwards, so we can't do that because there's some strange things in there. But one of the themes that continued to come up was this idea that siblings at the time were essentially parents light. That there was large age gaps often between children, and older children were very much expected to be sort of raised as mini parents. And this idea that this is what they are being trained to grow up and do is also become mothers and fathers.
I remember the books that he had. Covered them with paper bags. I mean, I used to do that too. Book.
Yeah, the book covers. We did that, I think through middle school, we did the paper bag book covers and things like that. Yeah?
It was very familiar.
Absolutely. It's funny what little things kind of last throughout multiple generations like that. And of course, I don't mean to imply that that entire film was completely outlandish, right? Like, some of the tips in there are just kind of being polite, like maybe not talking on your phone to the point where you're delaying dinner and things like that. But its larger message was a little outdated, shall we say.
Gosh.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciated it.
Oh my gosh.
Maggie Kase, you always do such a great job for us.
Thanks, Alan. I think this is number 5.
Something like that.
Yeah.